language for a second. I would also appreciate, if possible, if a panelist could give time signals in the chat, because I often forget. Prime Minister, whenever you're ready.
Sorry, mute my phone. Okay. You can raise your hand or you can go in the chat. Raising your hand is better. Okay. While Pride celebrations continue, the reality looks a lot more oppressive for many because violence against gay people continues and thousands of people are the victim of hate crimes. Trans people dominate headlines because of fears of conservatives. That means that these people and these children feel excluded from our world, feel excluded from these communities, feel truly oppressed. This is not cause for celebration. I'll do a couple of things. First, explain why it's the case that the transition toward pride and celebration has led to a huge sanitization of the movement, which doesn't fit the status quo. And second, I'll explain what riots look like as well. Then I'll put two arguments forward. One, on why this combats the status quo of backsliding that is an inevitable result of the focus on pride celebration. And second of all, on the inclusivity and representativeness of this movement. First of all, in terms of frame, the first thing I want to clear up here is why it's the case that sanitization is the inevitable result of a transition toward pride parades. The first thing is, you do not want to anger increasingly mobilized and prominent conservatives that have existed and have cropped up as a result of increasing political agitation, which means that it's very, very difficult to mount a strong message in conjunction with pride. Second, there's a corporate nature of pride, which means these sponsorships are incredibly valuable, allow these parades to continue and go forward. And as a result, the degree of messaging that you can actually put forward and the extent to which you can be subversive in this is extremely limited because of your corporate partners. But third, because silencing at some level is inherent to the celebration that is pride. People are told to shut up when they complain about the violence that has been perpetrated against them by the police forces whose banners are literally being held up in these very same celebrations. These are the types of things that mean sanitization is an inherent feature of pride parades. What then do the riots of our side look like? I want to point out that it is not people foaming at the mouth, breaking windows every opportunity that they get. It is protest movements that mean that we equate the queer movement more with things like BLM or the climate movement. It is not a club, but it is something that is actively agitating for political change to secure rights for people that are truly facing oppression and violent oppression at that. On either side, I think it's important to note that more and more moderates join the queer movement over time because people and queer people are distributed across society. Inevitably, over time, you begin to learn that your loved ones, people in your family, are in fact queer, are in fact gay. And that is something that means that people become more accepting through contact and the relationships that they have with these people to the queer movement. That means that acceptance in liberal areas is probably likely to be something that is symmetric on this side. The difference then is, to what extent can we agitate in the areas that actually matter, in the areas where violence is being perpetrated against gay and lesbian people, and where can we fix the problems of that? First argument then on combating the status quo of backsliding. The first question is, why is backsliding actually happening right now? And how is the celebration that is pride contributed? I want to point out that drag queens are being silenced and criminalized by conservative politicians right now. Trans athletes are dominating headlines and people are claiming that their children are being denied scholarships, that they can't use the same bathrooms, for example. There are high rates of violence against gay people in the South because of the same set of fear that we would have liked to have overcome. This backsliding is a result of a few factors. One, Republicans have become increasingly mobilized on this issue. And this is as a result of the fact that the prominence of religious wings in the Republican Party has meant that that level of lobbying and that narrative is a much more appealing narrative for the conservatives to push. So over time, that has been a much stronger narrative and one that has seeped into the Republican Party in ways that have been quite damaging. But second, nobody is agitating for change in the first place to the same extent. And what that means is that it falls behind in public consciousness, that the extent to which the queer movement matters to me as a voter is heavily diminished because the narrative that I get is one of things are okay. And that means that the liberal majority that the queer movement has already capitalized upon doesn't vote on that basis. All of those people that think that this movement is doing something good don't actually think that they are advertising problems that their vote can solve, even though they are supportive in the first place. So how has the celebration of Pride contributed to these problems? Why is that an important factor? The first thing is it has led to the perception that there is nothing wrong. But second of all, it has integrated moneyed interest, which has led to which has meant that it is incredibly hard to make a shift. Because to the extent that Pride requires some level of sanitization, it's very difficult then for Pride movements to shift. And that is why, for example, Pride in Toronto has had a really, really difficult time actually framing itself as subversive, even as issues start arising in the Toronto area, because of the fact that it looks really, really bad and it leads to the pulling of sponsorships, which mean that Pride can't be hosted in the first place. Why do riots work? Why is this a good alternative? A few things. One, you can mobilize a group, and that is important because it represents to politicians that there is an active set of voters that are angry about an issue, feel deprived in the status quo, and want to see change. Second, anger unites people. When you know that there are people around who are angry about the same things that you are, you feel a lot more comfortable entering into a movement. You feel protected because you're in a space that isn't just occupied by you and your thoughts, but the public expression of those thoughts means that you feel safer saying them. Third, messaging looks bad when you call out, messaging looks a lot worse for companies, so when they get called out by the queer movement, it's a lot harder for them to do things. So they're more likely to change their ways. What things do we get? We get changes in the school board at a very low level, local governments increasing bills that protect queer people, but also just better protections overall. I can see that there is a trade-off here, that maybe this means that you alienate some people who are unhappy about the direction the queer movement has gone. But this is vastly unimportant because there are many people unhappy right now that they are victims of oppression and violence. Two, because we protect more vulnerable groups. But three, effectiveness sustains buy-in. So to the extent that we believe riots work now, we think that in the long term, framing this movement as continually effective brings people in. CO, go.
Right. So what did the US state do to the Black Panthers when they continued to advocate for civil rights with violence?
But this is like a really, really deeply different thing. Like, we're not talking about giving the queer movement like guns. We're talking about them rioting in ways that are like highly productive. But also I would argue like the Black Panthers have been responsible for a huge amount of benefits for Black people as well. It's like, this is just a complete misnomer at all levels. Okay. Inclusivity and representativeness. Trans people being sidelined by the movement, intersectional movements that talk about issues of class and race being pushed down by the movement. This is cause for less of a celebration. And these are things that mean that people are unhappy in the movement. And I want to point out that that means that the movement right now is far more alienating than anything else. Why are people unhappy? One, because they feel like they cannot share their experiences. It feels like there is a lot of pressure when you are in an environment that is supposed to be a party. When people are happy and drunk around you, you feel like you can't express the things that you are concerned about. You can't express the way that you feel left out of this movement, and you can't express the types of concerns that you have about violence facing your community, when in fact you are suffering, you are likely to feel unhappy and marginalized by that movement. But second of all, the frame of a pride parade leads to a lack of penetration into the areas that we care about most. These are conservative areas. And I can see maybe there is backlash when people start rioting in these areas, but the truth is violence already exists now. So on the way up, we would rather protect people who are already the victims of violence than continue on a pride parade that has led to no changes in these conservative areas. For that reason, propose.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for their address, and I now invite the Leader of the Opposition.
Okay, can I be heard and seen? I think my
Yeah.
Wi-Fi just cut out. Okay. Okay, yeah, I'm speaking from a monitor, but my webcam isn't set up, so that's why I'm kind of like speaking like this because it's my computer camera right now. Sorry about that. 4 things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about what this trend actually looks like and why it has occurred and why we think this is a good thing. Then 3 arguments. 1, on why we better the perception of queer individuals, hence leading to better benefits for them. Second, why this is a gateway to more discussion on the continually existing problems of the community. And third, why we get better safe spaces and empowerment. I'll integrate rebuttals throughout. First then, what does this trend look like? I think OG just fails to characterize why we have changed from riots to celebrations in the first place. So here's why. We come about because of an increase in legislation that largely supports queer individuals. Most Western liberal democracies have already legalized things like gay marriage. They've already included like sexualities or gender identities in protections for example, employment discrimination. These are things that often required so much societal disruption, but were also able to get sufficient critical mass that lots of people wanted to go to these protests because they realized these were really, really important rights for people to have. And they were things that we were able to implement. After those were already implemented, there's far less incentive for individuals to go to these protests, insofar as legal change is not really something that we're aiming for right now. We think it's far more likely to be about things like changing social perception and the treatment of gay individuals within society and integrating them in, rather than legal change that we think needed such disruptive protests. Therefore, it has shifted to pride celebrations and parades. We're going to explain largely why this is a good thing and why, with the goals we have right now, riots and protests are actively harmful. First, then, on the better perception of queer individuals. The premise here is that what matters most is the safety and well-being of these queer individuals. They care about not being harassed, about reducing microaggressions, about more individuals being willing to accept them. Why would a continued pursuit of riots and protests be especially harmful? We think just in general, these often harm support. They're very disruptive. They're far less likely to get individuals to be willing to go out. So you have a far smaller critical mass who are even in these campaigns in the first place. They're often ineffectual, especially if it's not as pressing of an issue. Because just because you're talking about a certain issue in this riot doesn't mean things can be done. And often we think the emotion of these protests often means that the message is obscured or generalized. But if this is continuously used as the movement's main campaigning strategy, we say far more individuals are likely to detest queer individuals, hence leading to A, more personal harm, and B, less policy change. First, on personal harm. We agree most people are not actively violent or hateful of LGBT people. They didn't become this way. The problem is that they do not care strongly for or against the LGBT community, but this can be swayed. When you're disrupted routinely due to riots and protests, you can't go to your job this morning because the street is blocked. You're worried about your kids' safety because these people are out on the streets. Even if it is a peaceful protest, your own daily life is interrupted and often sometimes threatened. That is something that you are likely to consider far more, as opposed to the innate empathy that you might have. But second, you also have media or conservatives that are likely to overplay this, who will frame you as who will frame these protesters as hooligans and individuals who don't deserve to be heard out reasonably. But second, in terms of less policy change, easier to shut these protests down legally, right? The fact of the matter is that it's much harder to get permits for these kinds of protests, and often when it turns violent, as per the anger that people are feeling, this is much easier to shut down and delegitimize by governments themselves, making your strategy, even if it works at best, very short-termist. Why are pride parades and celebrations uniquely useful to changing social perception? First, on normalization, that more and more LGBT individuals show themselves in your community. You see hundreds of people marching down the street and you just realize how large the support is. You know what's really important in dealing with things like collective action problems, where maybe in moderate or not that liberal communities, you yourself might support LGBT people. You might be fine with helping them. But the problem is that you think everyone around you doesn't. You're worried that you're going to be judged if you come out in support of gay individuals. And insofar as you have no visibility of people who care about these LGBT individuals, you're far more likely to want to stay quiet and simply conform to what society believes. But when you have these kinds of parades and protests and celebrations, when you see far more individuals going out on the street and celebrating being LGBT, you realize just how many individuals actually agree with you. And that's when you're more likely to voice your concerns. That's when you're more likely to tell your friends or maybe your parents that it's actually okay to be LGBT, that these individuals are valid, and that's when we get more of that societal change. Second, why this is a gateway to more discussion on continually existing problems on the LGBT community. But before that, CG?
People's safety is also in danger during pride parades because of counter-protests. The actual change is that on our side of the house, we increase people's agencies by giving them the option of to riot, which doesn't exist on your side of the house.
Okay, so again, this is just very black and white, right? First, obviously, your safety can be significantly better as opposed to worse when you're talking about riots and protests versus parades. Often these parades are commissioned by governments and set up in places that are not going to be necessarily very disruptive. But just the idea of riots and protests, these are probably likely to have far more violence. And similarly, it's also not black and white in terms of the outcomes that you can get and what we have now. You might have some protests, but we're just talking about the majority of it being celebrations. It's not that this is not an option, but obviously we think we're still going to explain why we prefer having these kinds of celebrations as a whole. Second, why this is a gateway to more discussion on the continually existing problems of the LGBT community. The premise here is that OG's underlying premise, or what they want to achieve, is that, look, there's existing problems now and we want to fix them. How do we get more engagement with these problems through Pride celebration? Initially, Pride celebrations just generally are likely to get far more positive attention and engagement as opposed to riots and protests. So let's say you're one of the many people who looks at the big New York Pride parade. Maybe you see a celebrity or like a drag queen that you think is particularly like cool to watch, and you therefore follow their Instagram account. What happens then? Due to social media algorithms, more of these posts and images related to, for example, the LGBT community is likely to show up on your feed. You begin to see more and more of these kinds of information throughout like the many different information sources that you have. What happens then? That is that you're more likely to get further down in the pipeline to more serious accounts. Then you're going to be exposed to more Instagram accounts which aren't just about the big pride things, but actually voice concerns that like OJ talks about, that you have accounts saying, look, like suicide rates are very high among trans individuals, and here's why it's really harmful. The point is we can get people informed about that. We can get people to realize how harmful these problems are. The problem is you can't do that when no one engages in the first place. We are the first step to get you up on that ladder. The problem is OJ cuts off that ladder entirely. Argument on safe spaces and empowerment. That look, on either side, it is going to be difficult to change social perception and make things entirely better for gay individuals. It's not going to be perfect. But even if we can't achieve this, I think it matters most to at least provide safety and a community for gay individuals, to provide a home that welcomes them and that is accessible. Why do you create these safe spaces far better? First, just generally say that these pride celebrations are just far more accessible to people. So you don't need to put your safety on the line to stand alongside your fellow friends. You don't need to be there yelling about oppression that you already know exists, but rather you can be there and celebrate and talk about like good experiences that you've had with others. We think this is a good thing insofar as you're not constantly being told that you're a victim or need to do X, Y, Z as it's your duty as an LGBT person, but it's rather a celebration of your identity and a community that you can be with. For these reasons, vote on.
I would like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for their address, and I now invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hi, I'd like for people to POI me by turning on their cameras and waving. I'll take CO at some point. And also I generally like it when people turn their cameras on. Please don't send anything in the chat, including timestamps. Feeling supported and represented is all well and good, but this is conditional on problems around you being solved. So for example, conditional on knowing that there are homophobes in your community who will not strike back against you because there are people protecting you in the counterfactual. It's contingent on feeling like in the worst case that your job fires you, for example, that there's something you can fall back on. It's all contingent on making sure that there is some kind of safety net for trans and queer people. The problem with the movement as it stands right now is it's become complacent. They have found that many groups, the most privileged, the most liberal, have achieved a degree of safety, and they decided to rest on their laurels and abandon the rest of the country. 3 clashes today. The first is the celebration of Pride incompatible with recognizing the problems that still exist? I'm going to say yes for a few reasons. The first thing is because there are leaders, quote unquote, in the movement who are just more visible, who have a large following on social media, the ones that O celebrates, for example. The issue is they have a very difficult time platforming really tragic things because they're afraid that those will lose further engagement, because empirically lots of social media algorithms do worse when you have like sadness, for example. But 2, also because they're afraid of alienating corporate sponsors. I think the fact that this Pride movement has been co-opted by capitalist systems is really bad because it makes it impossible to challenge the status quo. 2, because you create a perception to society at large that things are doing okay, because the most visible events and interactions that people who have no other queer friends have in general is people marching, celebrating, laughing, drinking, like really enjoying themselves. And that's really great. And it really does tell people also that queer people are doing fine, that they're happy, and that there are very few problems around. The issue with this is twofold. Not only does it mean that that the cishet don't really care about this problem. Like they say, generally it's nice to support our queer friends, but they're unwilling to sacrifice their own interests by doing things such as picketing alongside us, or sacrificing like other interests that they might have, accepting higher taxes, for example, to vote for a politician who would really, really want to prioritize LGBTQ+ rights up top. But the second and even more pernicious harm that's associated with this perception of happiness is it undermines other people's efforts to express their own problems. Because if a trans person speaks out and says, I feel abandoned by the LGBTQ+ community, or I'm constantly a victim of hate crime in these ways, people around them think that they're ungrateful, that they're just not tapping into the right resources, that they're looking for attention and being dramatic. And the movement tries their best to shut that down as well, because they have their own self-perception of a movement that's going really, really well. Crucially, the mantra of the LGBTQ+ movement right now is not that everything is perfect. We're not going to force up to defend that, but they do have the mantra, no thank you, that things are going to get better, that there's an organic path to change, that without any effort, it's going to translate to the rest of the country. There are several problems with this. The first problem is that you don't create backlash and hatred against queer and trans people as a result of protesting and like voicing your opinion, being like, these various things are fucked. You have this hatred already. That's why you're protesting a system that is against you, that is oppressing you. There are two more reasons, though, that hatred becomes worse. The first reason is because by virtue of existing, people challenge religious conceptions that other people have, right? It challenges notions of masculinity, femininity, concepts that are very important to a lot of conservative people. But the second main reason for this is because if you're silent, you're a very easy minority to blame America's problems on. So, for example, think about the way in which Dylan Mulvaney was demonized as a result of appearing on Bud Light. We think all of that is reasons why we have more and more scrutiny on hatred resting on a minority of people that really doesn't matter that much. Like, why is that we keep reading about the trans girl who wins the fucking wrestling competition in Delaware? Like, it affects nobody, but the entire nation reads about this because there's a moral panic that unites Americans against queer people. We have to speak out against that. So they're going to say that, well, people are still sympathetic to these problems, right? That leaders still want to make a positive change. But the problem with this is twofold. One, it's infrequent because you're trying to downplay the suffering that people go through. But two, in your best case scenario, the extent of the support is sharing on your Instagram story and saying, let's give to this GoFundMe. You don't have collective action. You help people on a case-by-case basis and feel good about yourself. You don't have things such as organizing picketing outside the governor's house. You don't have just like groups of people walking trans kids to and from school to make sure they don't get picked on. You don't have retaliation against bigots might threaten the safety of members of your movement. You have a narrative that people genuinely believe that things are good, and you sacrifice the structure that actually allows us to defend our people. Before I go further, I'll take the POI from closing.
Right. So you say that you falsely say that everything is fine. However, this motion is only about collectivization. You can still say things are not fine through other communication channels.
So I think I've explained to you already why the way in which collectivization, like this is just like really, really soft, right? Because if you're primarily gathering in a particular context, and within these contexts, you're saying that things are fine, then it affects your fucking mindset. Okay, the second thing is I'm going to explain what exactly protesting and right gets us, which is so valuable. One, you stop backlashing and demonization by politicians and by famous people because you immensely increase the political cost of doing so, because you don't just have to defend yourself against angry liberal people who might be a minority of the voter base that you're willing to sacrifice, but you have to defend yourself against all the angry moderates who go, oh, holy shit, it's all this again. Why do we have to deal with the blockade on our street, for example? But number two, because I also think it's the case that like they have a claim about like backlash, for example. Like I really just think that the beauty of this is that the anger that you express is proportional to how supportive your community is. That is, if you're protesting an area where there are lots and lots of moderates who are on your side, you feel the need to go to less like extreme means in order to express this dissatisfaction. I think it's like really, really good. You're able to target our anger towards the contexts that are the worst. But the second thing is we keep a movement that is not toothless, that retains a core structure. Because when you have a movement that literally gathers to celebrate, there's no one individual goal you want to achieve. You just want to show up, show unity, have a good time. And this happens on a scheduled regular basis a year. It's really hard to mobilize people in response to legislation, for example. It's really hard to get people together to do things like set up food drives, like actually put their money towards an important issue. On the other hand, when you gather up riots and protests, these riots are usually protesting something, which means the movement as a whole has very clear goals that you're working towards. This not only means that you are doing things in a targeted way, actually pushing for political change, but you also are able to maintain a core group of people who dedicate their lives to the movement, who are constantly on the streets, constantly advocating for change. They tell us about how the Black Panthers got punished. The Black Panthers are heroes who paved the path for the liberalization of the rest of America's Black people because they showed that they were willing to put their lives on the line to change things. I think it's unacceptable that the liberals of the queer movement today have turned their backs on the rest of conservative America. It's critical that we do things such as agitate for those areas as well. We flock to the problems that are the most extreme. We emphasize as opposed to downplay the concerns that trans kids face. Never been prouder to propose.
Government.
Hi everyone, am I audible? Okay,
Yep.
sick. Just want to say a big thank you to my partner Mariana and to the Princeton team. Love everyone, and thank you to everyone in this round for judging and competing. That's so sweet. Okay. Cool. So I would prefer POIs audible, but also I'll have chat open if that's like more chill for y'all. Okay. I think the problem with opening half is that they operate in a binary in which we are in a world in which either you have pride celebrations or you have protests. I think that if it is true that backsliding has happened to such the extent that OG says, which I think it probably is very true, then there is so much anger that exists within queer communities in the status quo that protests eventually are inevitable. It is inevitable that that anger will boil over. Historically, protests have always been the way that people show that they are angry with the situation that they are in, that they are angry with the policies that are being passed, that they are angry with being like spit on in the street, having to face hate crimes, etc. These are things that are determined and destined to boil over at some point. And I think the biggest impact in today's debate is what happens when eventually that anger does boil over. Because even if the primary source or the primary way of collectivization in SQUO is pride celebrations, I think that it is likely that protests are inevitable, especially with the amount of backsliding that we have. What am I going to tell you in this speech? I'm going to talk mostly about what happens when something like a protest happens in like a scenario where pride celebrations are the main form of collectivization. And then I'm going to go into some like quick refutation of OO, the comparative, and finally why we weigh over OG. So first, I just want to start off as to say that like it is likely that in either world, some LGBTQ people, and no, I'm not here saying like a majority, I am saying some, are going to want to celebrate and some are going to want to protest. Why is this true, especially for the protests? The first is that there is always going to be some amount of disagreements within any social movement. This is especially true within the LGBTQ plus community because there is such an amount of like available resources as to how you think you should be able to make change, to pass laws, to get your voice out there. The second reason is that there are a lot of reasons why you should be angry in the status quo if you're someone who is part of the queer community, even if you are of enough privilege to be able to avoid things like hate crimes within your life or be situated comfortably within a family that accepts you. There are so many stories, especially with the presence of social media, the internet, etc., that really like make your blood boil, that make you want change right now. In a world where the norm is pride celebrations, it is way more likely that those who want to protest and perhaps those who do even find the courage to protest in small amounts are those who are going to be labeled as super duper extreme. This is for a few reasons. The first is that there is a perception that celebrations are positive and softer. I think this is quite intuitive, but also the perception that opening, no thank you, I'll take you around 5, that opening has also been operating on. The second is that celebrations just take up a lot of space in media in this world, right? They are things that are like, obviously because it's a celebration, it's very happy. People are more likely to repost it, more likely to say, hey, look at my outfit for Pride this year. The third is that there is a known and active alternative to protest within this world, which is to say that there will always be the question towards those who do choose to protest or who do want to protest. There will always be the question of why can't you be like the other queer individuals who just sit back and celebrate the rights that they already have? This is particularly harmful for a few reasons. The first is that it makes the queer movement seem way less important than other social movements that exist. And I think insofar as that we are in a society in which social movements do compete against each other for like news coverage and availability on the streets if you're protesting and social norms, right? If you are comparing like for example, the LGBTQ pride parade versus like a climate change protest, it is likely that you are going to think that one is more serious than the other for a few reasons, likely because there's a historical bias that like rioting equals seriousness. This can be seen in the the past few years with BLM. Most people took BLM seriously, that they thought that at the very least, the people who organized BLM thought that they were facing problems. Obviously they were. But also, it is likely, the second point is that there is no point in the near future in which you will be able to organize a true protest with a large amount of individuals who will buy into your protest. And I think in order for a protest to be successful, you do need a lot of buy-in, which is to say that you need people to be able to willingly give up amounts of money towards donating, amounts of security, to being willing to go on the streets at like 11 p.m. and face perhaps a backlash from police, etc. The third reason is that it's also just way easier for politicians and society to alienate those who are most vulnerable. And I think that the characterization here is that like people who want to protest in the status quo and who don't want to only attend pride celebrations and only celebrate the rights that they currently have are probably those who are most affected by things like hate crimes, probably those who are most pissed off, the most angry, the least privileged, the people who are faced most with things like homophobia, probably those who are like in the deep South, for example, in the United States, who don't have accepting communities and households. If it is easy to point to those who are more privileged, who can sit back or who prefer to sit back in celebrations, I'll take you in a second, in pride celebrations, then it is easy to also alienate those who are feeling so oppressed within their lives that they feel that protests are the only viable option towards getting change. Before I continue, I'll take opening.
Even if you believe there are no protests on our side, individuals can still voice their concerns through methods like social media movements or as parts of political campaigns. Are we more or less likely to get people to listen to this when they have a positive perception of LGBT individuals?
Yeah. I'm just saying that it is actually, I think, crazy to assume that like with the level of backsliding that we have in the status quo, 100% of queer individuals are going to be okay with just reposting, please give me rights, right? Like people are angry in the status quo. That is the status quo. People are very pissed off that like they are getting hate crimes, that trans athletes are constantly in the news. If you are a member of this community, you take it to heart. Obviously, these are your rights. Like people are pissed about this. I think that's the missing characterization. And a quick refutation to OO here about like moderate buy-in. I actually think that first, moderate buy-in to pride is like probably not as high as they say it is. Pride often feeds into stereotypes that like queer people are overly sexualized or overly sexual, or that they are loud, that they are like crazy, etc. That they like fun colors, like the rainbow, all the hate to like the Target's rainbow section. The second reason also that like since protests are inevitable, you completely destroy their reputation, their ability to make change, their ability to feel fulfilled, these queer individuals who have such anger to feel fulfilled on their side of the house. What is the comparative? I think on representation, it's easier to like operate as a proxy with riots than a celebration. And then finally, as to why we weigh over OG, I think the narrative that the problems that queer people face have been solved probably exists as they say, but our narrative that queer individuals who want to protest are ostracized is way more important, because first, these are the most vulnerable individuals. We should care about them most. These are the people who face hate crimes and have the most amount of anger and don't have the privilege to sit back. And second, that their narrative explains why change doesn't happen right now. Ours explains why change can never happen in the future. Very proud to stand with Gov.
I would like to thank the member of Gov, and I now invite the member of Op.
Alrighty, QIs in the chat, please. And I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, 3 quick responses to OG. Firstly, they say pride is sanitized and you only celebrate and you don't focus on the other stuff. I would say celebrations can be nuanced. You can say we've come a long way and there's still a long road ahead of us, which is to say this bill has passed, but we should still target this. This can still be celebration. 2, they say pride is too sanitized and that's bad. I think sanitization is also something that moves, right? 20 years ago during pride movements, the only representation was like gay white men. Currently, this is shifting continuously, right? Even like Starbucks has an advertisement with like a trans person, and this is being more and more represented, right? So this shows that there is a shift and that this is likely to improve in the future. Thirdly, they say you falsely show progress, and that's bad because it seems like everything is okay. Here I POI them. I say this motion is only about collectivization. There are other communication channels such as social media, articles, blog posts, or media representation, whereby you can still tell people that everything is actually not okay. Why must it be collectivization? OG says, well, because that's like what affects people's whatever perceptions in like a one-liner. They never defend that. I think OG is up. Our own extension then on why in the time when this shift happened, the rest of the leftist movement shifted, and when you don't follow them, you will be left behind. Firstly, then, let's frame out historically when this happened. Some just like dates. Stonewall riots happened in 1969, right? And the shift towards pride occurred somewhat quickly after, and more peacefulness quickly after. Even many people who participated in the Stonewall protest themselves then later joined politics or different political movements that were then able to lobby governments and whatnot and engage in collectivization in peaceful ways that is allowing them to actually affect any change and not just be violent, right? I think the reason for this is that you needed to be violent at that time, because oftentimes violence was self-defense, right? Someone raids like your own safe space and you need to be violent to protect it. As that decreased, you no longer need violence to defend yourself. It now becomes about what is better for perception, what is better for signal. Second point of framing here is that the broader left-wing movement had a massive shift mid-1970s, right? So roughly 6 years after Stonewall riots. They had to shift in two ways. Firstly, they shifted from focusing on economics and class politics to identity politics. And secondly, they became a lot less violent and a lot more conformist with the system. There's two structural reasons as to why this happened. A, because there were stagflation under leftist governments at the time, which showed that economic policies that they were proposing, at least in the eyes of the people, don't work. The actual cause of the stagflation is a different story. Two, though, you had massive revelations of all the horrors that happened under communist regimes, that those own parties and those own movements oftentimes associated themselves with. Therefore, they had to rapidly shift their stance, go from class politics to identity politics and renounce violence, right? This looks like very peaceful civil rights movement. The left adapted in the status quo, right? The queer movement adapted and they went on board. This motion shifts that. And we're the first team to like actually debate this retrospectively, right? Like every other team debates this in the status quo. How will then, which means that you will probably be alienated from the left because the left cannot tarnish its reputation. How will this alienation look? Firstly, the left movement will be publicly distancing itself from the queer movement, right? Because it doesn't want to be associated with something that is still perceived as violent, something that is still perceived as radical, something that alludes back to all of the things that they want to distance themselves from. What are the harms of this? You lose your legitimacy in the public eye for two reasons. A, because the party that lobbied for you within the system, within the political system and voting and all that, which generally people respect, is now alienating you from that. So you're not part no longer of a system that people would respect. But also, leftists themselves are oftentimes perceived as radical. And the fact that someone who is perceived as radical has also pushed you out means that you are seen as even more radical. The second harm, though, is that you lose connections to the party and you lose the ability to like have access to all of this. This looks like lacking know-how, for example, firstly, which means that the party and the broader movement can no longer do things like help you with campaigns, tell you who to pressure and whatnot, because they know that if they were to associate with you, there's a threat that this would be publicized and therefore they can't do that. But the second harm here is also that you literally like lose your direct representation in politics. It's no longer expedient for leftist parties in parliament to lobby for queer rights when everyone else sees you as radical. Another harm, though, is that you are seen as the black sheep amongst other identity movements. So other identity movements, such as civil rights movements, went on board with less violence, and you had things like MLK speeches and whatnot, which means that even for like conservatives who are both racist and let's say homophobic at the time, they say, well, at least the blacks are doing this. let's take a look at what the queer people are doing, and they're the crazy ones, right? And because of that, you lose touch even more, because essentially the other identity groups anchor people's perceptions of what is a legitimate form of collectivization, which delegitimizes you even more. Before I continue, I'd like to take OG.
The problem with your piecing historical threads together is that the baseline, that is, that we became more pride-oriented after Stonewall, is just incorrect. This is a pretty recent, like 10, 15-year phenomenon with pride and commercialization.
No, this is not. No. Pride movements have been going on for a long time. And even if it's not pride movements, it's the shift towards more peaceful movements and less violent and rioting movements, right? What are the impacts of this? Firstly, you historically worsen the treatment and recognition of those people, right? You're demonized in the media. This affects how people interact with you day to day. This affects the way people think about you, and the way that people then vote within parties and whatnot, right? Secondly, though, that people like vote in elections. Secondly, though, you lose your ability to affect policy, right? You have lost touch with other leftist movements who are now forced to limit their level of engagement with you. But thirdly, I think this also affects a lot of queer people who are not out or who are not associating themselves with the movement, right? It's like, why would I associate myself with something that is demonized as much? Or I'm even more afraid of my parents' response when they think that the movement is so bad. The bottom line of all of this is you essentially slow down the progress that the movement has made since the 1970s by like a few years, right? And this affects everyone to the present day. What is the weighing then? Against OO, we beat them on perception, but also we have acknowledged that there still has been some way to go with legislative change, and we are able to then co-opt that benefit as well. But also, our case is more historically accurate, whereas they focus on the status quo. So OO is essentially debating that this House opposes version of the motion, not that this House regrets it. We beat CG because CG has a super high-burning case about like everything boiling up, right? CO.
I would like to thank the member of opposition for their address, and I now invite the government whip.
Hello, am I audible?
You are.
Beautiful. Please make POIs audibly, and if you can, like, do a little hand wave. Sorry if this delays things, but I just want to say a huge thank you to Genevieve for being my partner, for being so supportive and so lovely, to the Princeton team for also being supportive and lovely. We're really happy to be here. It's a really big deal for us. So yeah, thank you, everyone. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Despite the fact that there exists a historical narrative that peaceful protests are preferable, that doesn't mean that movements generally just abandoned protest and riots generally. There exist movements such as the Black Panther Party in the United States, the Irish Republican Army, or the Red Brigades in Italy, who continue to use these violent, who continue to use like comparatively more violent means of protest, i.e., opposition can't just make the historical claim of like, oh, everybody did this, therefore like they would be perceived as more radical. But assume that you buy the case inside closing opposition. We think that if you're the single like social movement that continues to adhere to its original like methods of protest and rioting, that probably makes you significantly more effective than other movements, because it sends the message that you're actively willing to sacrifice buy-in of moderates in a context where most movements are becoming more peaceful. What this communicates is that your issues are actually like extremely urgent. You need change now. You need to continue to be listened to by politicians. You need to make yourself distinguishable. To that extent, we believe that not only like does that mean that you gain a lot of more like attention in social media, in newspapers, etc., but that like your message isn't diluted in the sense of like every other movement also being peaceful. But I will talk more about that later. First, I want to address OO, then weighing Genevieve's case and why we think we win this debate. I think OO is very contradictory from the beginning, in that in their frame they tell you that the reason why like the LGBTQ movement transformed into being like more pride focused as opposed to rioting is because of an increase in like legislation in favor of queer people, and essentially because like things improved. I think that this massively undercuts their case, right? Because if riots happened before and things improved to the extent where you can now like celebrate, then that means that, hey, riots were actually quite effective. But now I think that their biggest point is this idea that on their side of the house, you are better able to change the social perception of queer people, which means that like moderates and people who were previously conservative probably treat queer people better, and that's a really, really good thing. We think that this is actually not the case. We think that the pride movement pride parades unfortunately feed into existing stereotypes that conservatives hold and actually make them treat queer people a lot worse. I think that the argument against queer people is generally a moral one at heart, i.e. the idea that they're a negative influence on society and that queer people are like against traditional family values. We think that this is horrible, obviously, but let's take a look at a pride parade. A pride parade looks like people wearing revealing clothing, sometimes drinking, feeling like sexually liberated, kissing each other and being physically affectionate, because the precise point of a pride parade is for it to be liberating, for it to be a space where you're safe and proud of your identity. But what this means is that the moderate perception that LGBTQ movement is likely going to like deteriorate society is like confirmed. To that extent, we believe that you don't actually change people's mentality for the positive, but you do the exact opposite. Second response to this point is I think like normalization occurs rather symmetrically. I think this was a point that like Isaac mentioned at one point, which is like demographically, queer people exist in all facets of society. Unlike issues of like race and gender that are secluded to a particular group of people that doesn't interact with other group of people, a rich white man can be gay, a single indigenous mother can also be gay in every single country. To that extent, the likelihood that at some point in your life you have a personal connection with queer people is like huge, and over time people become less shitty. Lastly, they talk about how there's a positive effect on people who view pride parades and feel more comfortable with their identity. We think that it is true, and it probably happens at a greater scale on-site opposition, but it isn't exclusive, right? This type of validation can also happen if you have like a queer uncle or a queer classmate that becomes your friend, or if you like view queer people in movies or in social media. It is unclear why attending a a pride parade is going to be the tipping point in like you accepting your identity. We think that the opposite is like to be the case, because queer parades oftentimes exhibit like a level of liberalization that perhaps you're like uncomfortable with, and to that extent they don't really explain why people who are closeted and feel shameful of themselves will actually identify with things such as the pride parade, as opposed to what Genevieve tells you of identifying with the things that like protests would like push forward the most. Lastly, I just want to say that I think historically citizens and governments have become like a lot less tolerant of like excessive violence and like violent response towards protest, i.e. these are Western liberal democracies, like hate crime laws exist, people get incarcerated if they violate people's rights, etc. But in general, there's also just backlash against governments who use excessive force, as we see like in the forefront of the BLM movement in the United States. Like I think it's just politically inconvenient, increasingly so historically, now brutal response to protests, and like this also means like policy change. But I think in weighing, even if you buy their whole argument on like increased violence, I think like people do opt into this, right? If people participate in protests, they know that there's a risk of their safety being compromised, but they do so anyway because they consider that the thing that they're fighting for is worth them risking like that vulnerability. To that extent, we believe that that's like a valid choice that people make, and they don't really justify otherwise. Let me talk about Genevieve's case then and why we think it beats OO. The first thing is competition between social movements exists. In the moment when the queer movement transitions away from riots, it makes it significantly more difficult for them to harbor support. This is our biggest impact, I believe. I believe that in general, there's a group of moderate and liberal people who are empathetic and socially aware. But even if they are, they won't donate to every single good movement. They donate to what they consider to be the most in need of help. Why is this a very competitive and has been historically a very competitive atmosphere? First, all movements advertise in social media and newspapers wherever they can be seen. There's an issue of crowding out and people being overwhelmed by the amount of information that they receive. This crucially deals with the counterfactual brought in opposition of oh, you can just have an Instagram post. When I see 2,000 Instagram posts a day, I'm not really drawn into your social movement. Secondly, most people don't have a surplus income or free time to donate to movements. Therefore, supporting one movement does come at the trade-off of supporting another movement. It's also just emotionally exhausting. It wasn't enough for up to say social media exists. Why do we get more support on our side of the house? I think people associate the protests and riots with a deep social injustice that social movements are fighting because there's more extreme language, it's more organized and intentional. The message is direct. There's a sense of urgency and a sense of proportionality that people identify in the moment when people protest, because that's what they have a historical bias of identifying these sort of things. They know that people are missing work, taking a stance against the government, etc. It's more of a big deal. I'll take a point. Yeah.
So the existing issues you talk about, like trans suicide rates or job discrimination, are caused by underlying negative perceptions, not by a lack of donations. Are we more or less likely to fix those when you show queer people
you need
positive?
Donation. I understand your point, but you need donations in order to enact policy change, i.e. you need money in order to rally people to go house to house in order to fight things such as conversion therapy. Obviously social movements need money, they need people, that's really important. What does this weigh against OG? I think OG focuses on how do queer movements market themselves and how they're perceived at face value, but we give you more specific tipping point analysis about how people will actually be motivated to support the queer movement. Lastly, on the heterogeneity of queer movements, I think Genevieve very brilliantly tells you that people face a range of injustice, and a lot of people are more mad than other people, and they have different preferences for the type of activism that they want to pursue. The most vulnerable people, most most likely want to riot because they are people for whom their rights are being violated on the daily. The difference is, on side opposition, these individuals have no avenue for fighting for these rights because they will be actively branded as like being massively extreme, as undercutting the reputation of the queer movement, and just like being likely denied or like ostracized by the queer movement itself so that it doesn't lose support. We think that this is really, really bad because it means that the people who are most vulnerable aren't listened to, aren't given a platform, and rather more rights are taken away from them in the moment when they can't even protest in the way that they want. Very proud to be in Gov.
I would like to thank the government whip for their address, and finally invite the opposition whip.